Every week, you get to hear the music of Nate Schweber at the top and the bottom of this show. He's my good friend, and he's also the author of This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis Devoto, and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. It's now available in paperback, and it's a book you should read. In the time since this interview first aired, when the hardcover was released in 2022, the book has gone on to win the High Plains Book Award and receive the First Place Book Award from the Outdoor Writers Association of America. If you live in the greater New York metro area, he's going to be at the Patagonia store in Soho on Thursday, October 19th at 7 o'clock. And on Monday, October 23rd at 6:30 p.m., he'll be at the Barnes & Noble on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. Please enjoy this conversation. It's one of my favorites that's been recorded since the start of this show.
All right, red light on.
Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Hall, and there's a change in the music this week because I'm delighted that Nate Schweber is here sitting across from me. He's a musician, you know that, but he's also a journalist, my good friend, and the author of the forthcoming book, This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis Devoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. We're already into the cocktails, so stick around. But first, All About Beer is back online and producing original content for beer enthusiasts and professionals. Visit allaboutbeer.com to see the latest. And if you want to support us in this endeavor, we set up a Patreon for both readers and professional companies in the beer space. Check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer to learn more. Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point of sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/drinkbeer. That's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer to take your retail business to the next level today. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer. I've known Nate Schweber going on about 20 years now. We've been colleagues, friends, and even co-authors. And I can say without a doubt that he is one of the hardest working reporters that I've ever met. He has a keen eye for detail, enjoys a good drink, and knows how to rock with the best of them. He's a raconteur with endless curiosity and compassion and great passion. My life is better because I know him. His chords are familiar to listeners of the show as it's opened up every episode since we started. And it was even a part of the old After Two Beers show I did for All About Beer. We've been to breweries and crime scenes together. We've had adventures and even wrote a book together. Maybe you've heard of it, Indiana Breweries. It was released in 2011 and has since gone on to sell tens of copies. He lives in Brooklyn these days, but he grew up in Missoula, Montana, and has always had a passion for outdoor reporting. A previous book, Fly Fishing Yellowstone, is a must for any angler looking for the story of trout in the historic park, and not just about the fish, but also tales of the streams and its history. His latest book tells a remarkable story about conservation, activism, and journalism, with belts of solid drinking thrown in here and there. It's called This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis Devoto, and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. It'll be published on July 5th, 2022. And I cannot say this enough. Pre-order a copy now. It tells the story of a husband and wife team that took on special interests and politicians like Joe McCarthy and worked to protect land that should have been protected. And along the way, they strike up a friendship with a woman who would alter the course of cooking in America and even around the world. It's suspenseful, meticulously researched, frightening with bits of levity, and historically important with mirrors to today. It's one of the most engaging books I've read in a long time. And I'm not just saying that because he showed up at my house with a bottle of gin. But of course, that's where we start. Here's our conversation.
This is delicious. All right, tell me what this is again.
Oh boy, I'm glad you like it. We are drinking a Devoto Dry Martini.
Which is comprised of what?
Comprised of, and this is a recipe from Bernard Devoto, who, along with his wife Avis, I wrote a book about. He was very strict about his philosophies in alcohol, and he said that there were three things that America gave the world that were better than anything else: rye and bourbon and the Devoto Dry Martini, which is 3.7 parts gin per 1 part dry vermouth with a twist of lemon only.
And that is what we are currently drinking. Those are the only 3 things?
Only 3 things. You have to ice it. It has to be
okay.
You have to shake it or stir it with ice.
No, but the things that he was proud of with America.
Well, he was being grandiose. There was certainly far more that he was proud of about America. But when he wanted to emphasize a point, he would speak hyperbolically.
As I was reading this America of ours, and there's a lot that I want to touch on with you this afternoon, but especially in the earlier part of the book, when you were talking about them and the parties that they would throw and the company that they would hang out in, and I'm thinking of writers that I know, and when writers hang out, and there's a certain level of drinking that exists, and you and I have done this before. But when you look at it through historical context sometimes, you gotta wonder how they functioned with what they were saying. Because 3.7 parts gin. Yeah. 2 of these is gonna and it seems like in the book, like the research that you found, they were doing it up and quite often.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. It was a daily ritual. Every day at 6 p.m. was the Devoto Dry Martini hour. And then there was wine with dinner, and there was whiskey after that. But through it all, this guy was, he would drink into the night whiskey, but he would be writing the whole time.
Was it the Hemingway write drunk, edit sober?
Did Hemingway say it? Maybe he did.
I don't know if it was Hemingway who said it. Somebody said that.
I don't.
That's one of those misattributed quotes somewhere.
Sure. I mean, among the things that are respectable and admirable about these writers is how they were able to function and be so productive while also consuming so much alcohol.
Yeah, because we're not talking about them in like their 20s or 30s.
Yeah, correct.
Like, that's the thing. Like now that I'm in my 40s, it's like good luck. We're drinking these at literally coming up on 3:00 in the afternoon, and I already have NA beers lined up after this because I need to be functional tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. No, I drank some Gatorade on the way down.
We're so old. We're so old. He was prolific, though. Bernard DeVoto was a prolific writer, and what I was struck about reading this book, and you've been talking about this book to me for a couple of years now.
Long.
But what I was struck about was how little I knew about him going into it, and the company that he kept, or the people that he went up against, are still names that are known. And I'm thinking of like Ansel Adams is featured in the
Friend
book,
of him.
or going up against Joe McCarthy, or Senator McCarran. Names that are still that sort of resonate. And even obviously Julia Child in the book. But Bernard DeVoto, and maybe this is just my ignorance, I don't think he was as well known as some of the company that he kept. But the work that he did reverberates to this day, and somewhere along the line, it seems like his name dropped off.
It did. It's a curious thing, and I'm not proud to say it, but I grew up in Missoula, Montana, and close by is a memorial grove of cedar trees in a national forest dedicated to him. I must have passed by it dozens of times growing up in Montana. I never knew who Bernard DeVoto was until I found one of his books at the Strand bookstore in New York City. And, in the mid-'50s, he was... a lot of literary critics presumed he was going to be as well remembered as Hemingway and as Faulkner and as Rachel Carlson and Carl Sandburg, Robert Frost, but he did drop away. And I think reasons for that include that he wrote about the West, which a lot of the literary world was concentrated in the East, especially the Northeast, and he was sort of seen as a literary or a regional writer only. He evolved over time. He was also a very controversial writer. So he had such strong opinions, like about the best things that America gave the world being bourbon and rye and the Devoto Dry Martini. He could be so opinionated so forcefully that anybody that doesn't want to be offended by something ought not read Bernard DeVoto, because he's whatever cows you hold sacred, he will prod those sacred cows. So I think all that combined, made him kind of fade away.
But it's interesting because reading through the book, I didn't get that impression, because he didn't seem controversial. He seemed like a proper journalist who was writing about things that Americans should care about.
He very much was, but in the times, in the 1930s, the nation swung very far to the left. It was the Great Depression. People were questioning whether capitalism was viable. Communist and socialist candidates for office got millions of votes across America. And there was Bernard DeVoto writing that Marxism was a, quote, imbecile delusion, and that anybody that believed in communism or socialism was guilty of, quote, monumental credulity. So he was very much out of step with the politics of the 1930s. And then the nation swung very far to the right in the McCarthy era, and he was criticizing McCarthy from the jump. Edward R. Murrow, the broadcast journalist, gets credit for criticizing McCarthy on national TV in 1954. Bernard was criticizing McCarthy as far back as 1949. But again, that put him sort of out of step with the way the politics of the country were swinging. He stayed in his lane. He didn't change, but the country swung back and forth.
There's a number of fights that you document in the book of what he was passionate about. And a lot of them are environmental issues that I think have still a standing in today's world.
Massively.
Obviously, I'm encouraging everybody to go out and buy the book and read the book. But can you sort of sum up as best you can what the focus of his work entailed?
He was
the environmental stuff. Yeah.
He was a passionate defender of America's public lands. Some of the best known public lands in America are the national parks, but there are also the national forests, and there's also land under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Land Management. It belongs to all Americans. It's a birthright of all Americans, and there's hundreds of millions of acres of it, mostly in the West. And Bernard grew up in the West. He grew up in Ogden, Utah, and he saw from his grandparents being farmers how these public lands and the protection of them was critical for protecting water in the West. So he knew that life in the western United States, which is a dry climate, depended on the protection of its water, which meant the protection of its public lands. And so all his life he was, but especially the last 10 years of his life, he was a passionate defender of public lands, and there were several movements to either sell off those public lands or to have the resources on those public lands be funneled by powerful politicians like Pat McCarran, who was aided by Joe McCarthy, funnel those resources to a politically connected few. So that's what Bernard DeVoto spent, especially the last part of his life, fighting against, selling off public lands and giving away the resources.
I mean, what was so interesting is growing up, in my era, and knowing about the national parks and knowing about, the importance of it, and knowing that these were established not long before he started writing about them. But
True.
It almost strikes me that the fight over this land of public versus private versus, enjoying versus profiteering almost started at the jump.
It did. Yeah, it did. And that was part of the reason that public lands were created, that, both Presidents Roosevelt really expanded the shared the Commonwealth of the United States. They protected these public lands because there was so much monopolization of land going on, and that was particularly a crisis situation in the West, because if land got overgrazed, if it got clear cut, that would damage the water supplies out west, and there just isn't as much water in the West as there is in the East, which was what made those lands so valuable.
Was he successful in his time?
As a conservationist, I think he was incredibly successful. Again, there were these plots to get rid of public lands, to exploit them, that would have gone through if he wasn't there paying attention. He really was one of the only people in America with a national media platform who knew about the history of public lands, who knew how important they were, but also knew how to communicate about them extremely effectively. So as a conservationist, he was extremely successful. He was also incredibly successful in his day as a writer, as a historian. He won a Pulitzer Prize. He won a National Book Award.
And that's one of the things that, again, sort of strikes me as more people should have known about him. Like it sounds like the work that he did should be in history classes, and maybe they are. Just not at my high school. But clearly yours as well. Where growing up in the West, where
I should, I should have known about the guy. I grew up in Missoula, Montana. I learned about Lewis and Clark ever since I, first started going to school. And Bernard DeVoto wrote one of the really definitive books about Lewis and Clark. And again, I'm not proud of it. I hadn't picked up on him until just 5, 6, 7 years ago.
What was it about the book At the Strand that caught your attention?
Well, John, I owe my career to you, man.
Stop.
I really do. Listeners out there,
I've read the acknowledgement, and it made me tear up. And you're very, very sweet.
My goodness,
but
it's not absolutely true. But here,
my ego is big enough already on this show.
So
thanks,
to listeners out there, John. John was at the New York Times back in 2005. He'd been doing it for several years, and he was telling his bosses, you need to get somebody else. And that somebody else that they got, God bless him, was me. And I started pitching story ideas to that, the Times and other publications. And, being a freelance journalist, I would get rejected. So I thought I might do better at getting story pitches accepted, especially about the West, if I simply knew more about the West, if I knew more history about the West. And so I started reading Western history, and that's what brought me to a Bernard DeVoto book in the Strand.
It's fascinating to me, right? Because growing up in Montana, which I did not, but you did. I phrased that the wrong way. But even growing up in New Jersey,
yes,
we know that this was Indian land.
Yeah.
The name of the town that I live in is named after a Native American chief.
Yeah.
And there's all the rivers and the towns and the areas of the state, but it's not taught.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that are very, very quickly forgotten. And I mean, we're removed by 50 years maybe?
Yeah. Yeah. Not long.
Has the book taught you anything on the importance of history, even if it was journalism of the moment, which a lot of his work very much was?
Yeah. It taught me a tremendous amount. One of the things that struck me or occurred to me when I was working on the book was, that the history of the West can really be understood in a series of resource raids.
Okay.
It's sort of vaguely understood as just people just went west. Well, it wasn't just people of European origin going west. It was waves of people. There were fur trappers that went first, and then there were loggers, and then there were grazers, and then there were irrigation farmers. Each of these were grabbing resources of the West. Each happened in successive decades. And the dispossession of native people went right along with that. So they were, their lands were dispossessed as the resources on them were plundered. And that same model was happening with public lands. So national forest lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, national park lands even, these were coveted by people that wanted to raid the natural resources on them. So, one of the things that occurred to me was just that there was a lot of similarity between the way Native Americans were dispossessed of their lands and these attempts to dispossess public lands, National Forest Service lands, national park lands, Bureau of Land Management lands. And the other thing was that, especially with these people that led these attempts to liquidate public lands and to grab the resources on them for their cronies, Pat McCarran and Joe McCarthy, the techniques that they used. They were demagogues. They started by dismissing the people that opposed them, and they elevated to demonizing the people that opposed them. And that was obviously very resonant in our time right now.
And they are two of the main villains, if that's a word that I can use in this story. I don't know if that's fair or not.
They're definitely the antagonists against the protagonists of the story. Definitely.
But McCarthy obviously comes to mind. But Pat McCarran was not super familiar to me, mostly because, as you point out in the book, like McCarthy eclipsed him.
Very much.
But his name still survives today. Anytime somebody lands at the Vegas airport.
Yeah. Well, actually, they did just change recently. In the last year, they've changed the name of the Vegas airport. It was McCarran International Airport. I think it's a Harry Reid International Airport. Now, Harry Reid actually eventually won the Senate seat that Pat McCarran used to have. But, Pat McCarran is largely forgotten, actually, for a lot of the same reasons that Bernard DeVoto is largely forgotten. He was, at the time that he was in office, Nevada had the lowest population of any state. So he was, again, sort of seen as this regional figure, a guy from the West who just dealt with Western things. And he very much used that obscurity to his advantage to do some just incredibly, pass some incredibly repressive and oppressive legislation.
What's a good example of that?
Well, the paramount example of that is this bill called the McCarran Act. It was the Internal Security Act of 1950, but it's popularly known as the McCarran Act because he was the guy behind it. And one of the provisions in it was the legalization of peacetime concentration camps in America. And this was not like the shameful internment of people of Japanese heritage during World War II. The McCarran Act made it so that anybody who might be suspected of being a communist could be rounded up and put in a concentration camp with no due process. That was on the books. It's not, what it would take was a presidential declaration of an emergency. That's what would trigger it, which everybody at the time thought was very far-fetched. Again, speaking in 2022, one is thankful that was repealed in the 1970s. But that was the apex of what McCarran could do, and what Joe McCarthy, by creating this political and cultural atmosphere of fear, facilitated, was this bill that ultimately, made concentration camps legal in America.
Are there...
Isn't this a fun conversation?
Everybody take a drink. I will say, as this gin quickly empties from my glass, this is delightful.
Oh, I'm so happy you hear it.
For mid-June, and
it's a good one. And I think we're honoring the DeVotos because today is a holiday. It's Juneteenth, and they would, on Sundays, especially in the summertime, in the afternoons, they would sip martinis with their best friends, their best literary friends, in their backyard and talk. So I feel like this is spiritually harmonious with what the DeVotos did.
Are there... Obviously, things have changed, and people have tried to create new land grabs, have tried to repeal lands, have tried to skirt regulations. Are there things that still exist to this day that Bernard DeVoto helped stay alive?
Well, the fact that we still have the Bureau of Land Management is a testament to Bernard DeVoto coming to its defense right after it was created in the 1940s. The fact that we still have so many acres of the national forests, they're part of this land grab plan that he exposed and thwarted in the 1940s was to sell off as many as 75% of the acres that are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Forest Service. So the fact that we still have those places and national parks and national monuments, that is a great, that's one of his legacies. And, his philosophy about public lands was, kind of like James Madison's philosophy about freedom, that the broader the base of people that are invested in it, the broader the base of people that know about it, the more secure that freedom is going to be. So the fact that he brought awareness of public lands to so many people that were not aware of it, especially at a time that, who knew about the Bureau of Land Management in 1946? It was brand new. Bernard DeVoto came to its defense and told millions of Americans about it. And he broadened the base of people who knew about it and who understood their stake in protecting those lands.
For a lot of the work that he did, he would communicate directly to people through magazines, through weekly magazines, back when weekly magazines were actually still a thing.
Yeah.
And his Easy Chair column.
Yeah, in Harper's Magazine.
Yeah, was... I don't remember from the book. Do you remember what the circulation was?
Harper's Magazine didn't have an enormous circulation, but
But it had influence.
Very much, yeah. For example, Adlai Stevenson was an avid reader of Harper's, so was John F. Kennedy. So, Bernard knew that he wasn't going to reach an enormous audience, but he was going to reach an influential audience with Harper's. And he also, in other times, he was a freelance journalist, and he would strategically put articles in other magazines. For example, he wrote a story about headlined, "Shall We Let Them Ruin Our National Parks?" And he put that in the Saturday Evening Post, which was the biggest circulation magazine of its era.
Yeah. I'm just trying to draw for the non-news nerds that are listening, though. Is there something comparable these days that he would have, that you could compare that column in Harper's to?
That's a great question because, one of the stories of our era is just the fracturing of media. One could write for weekly magazines back then and command a big share of the media landscape. I think, wow, that's a great question. I think today it's about finding reputable sources of information.
Yeah.
The All About Beer podcast.
Well,
man.
sure, of course. Yeah.
No, but there's if you're interested in the West, there's great writers who write about it. There's Terry Tempest Williams. There's Timothy Egan. There's High Country News. There's
Nate Schweber.
Oh my goodness, jeez, you've been drinking.
The book, though, also, and you don't get to this super directly, but I was able to see the fracturing of news through the book, of being able to write for a bunch of different places and the influence that places has, but then also how, especially during the McCarthy era, places started to blacklist writers and were more worried about advertising dollars than the truth.
Yeah.
And by and large, there's a lot of places that subscribe to that now, where stories will just never see the light of day in certain publications because it's going to upset, people. And, it just reminds me of, the old adage of writing without fear or favor, or, let no one dare to say anything false, to let nobody, dare to print anything, So it's there's, I just butchered that quote because the gin is kicking in. But there is, it was interesting as a journalist to see that begin through his work.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Joe McCarthy attacked the magazines that Bernard DeVoto wrote for, and some of Harper's never wavered. Harper's always loyally, faithfully. They published him every single month for 20 years. But other magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, Fortune, they stopped accepting Bernard DeVoto stories while they were getting attacked by Joe McCarthy because they were scared of the retribution. And what that meant was that he got his microphone cut right when he was addressing his largest ever audience about conservation. There was a crisis situation in national parks, and because of McCarthy, Bernard couldn't get his message out. So he had to figure out other ways, and he did.
More with Nate Schweber in a minute as I switch from gin to beer. But first, thanks to this episode's sponsors, and I hope you'll give them a closer look. You know that's the sound of another sale on your online Shopify store. But did you know Shopify powers selling in person too? That's right. Shopify is the sound of selling everywhere, online, in store, on social media, and beyond. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/drinkbeer. That's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/drinkbeer. And now back to my backyard and more with Nate Schweber.
For as much as this book is about conservation, protecting of lands, environmentalism, activism, just being a good citizen, this is also a love story.
Yeah, it's a dual biography. It's about Bernard DeVoto and his magnificent wife, Avis. And they were an amazing couple. And I should rewind and make sure that everybody understands that everything I have previously said on so far today about Bernard DeVoto, none of that would have been possible without Avis DeVoto. They were amazing partners. They had a deep love. They were together till death did them part. And they were just perfectly matched. They fell in love. It was scandalous. It was taboo. He was a teacher at Northwestern University in 1922. He was 25 years old, and she, 18 years old, was his smartest student. And but they bonded over a love of books. They both loved books. They both wanted to create books. Her as an editor, him as a writer, and he suffered. He had mental health challenges, especially when he was younger. He went through some suicidal depressions, and Avis was really the one that got him through that. And later in life, even, he was definitely tormented, and Avis was the one that kept him grounded, and also, helped him brainstorm story ideas and edited them and copy edited them and proofread them and indexed them and answered his mail and bore their two sons and kept a house up and cooked incredible meals for him because he loved to eat and she loved to cook. And that sort of ties into why we know about Avis DeVoto in pop culture today.
Well, sure, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute, but there is... What was so fascinating to me was the research that went into this, because they were both so prolific, not only in what was published, but what was unpublished, and that their letters survived.
Yeah, I was so lucky with that. Bernard, not only did he publish prolifically, but he also wrote letters prolifically, and there's an archive at Stanford University of all his stuff. And then Avis was also a prolific writer, a prolific letter writer, and she has an archive at Harvard University. And it's between those two. I was blessed with an abundance of archival riches for working on this project.
You talk about his struggles. You talk about the scandals. There's bits of marital discord that show up throughout the book. There's a whole series of letters that Bernard writes to another woman, and while because of what you wrote, it wouldn't have able to become physical, but there was an affair of the mind, affair of the heart. You were able to glimpse the lives of these two and so many of the other people that they came across as well. And seeing the beginning of friendships, the end of friendships. I've never done a project like this. Is it like binging a Netflix show? Does it feel intrusive at any point? Does it feel? I don't know if anybody who writes letters like that ever imagined that in 2022, if they're writing these in the 40s, 50s, 60s, that there's going to be, a guy that they've never heard of writing about. And that's great because they're honest all throughout. But was it weird?
As a journalist, it was awesome.
Sure. Jackpot.
I know. I mean, truly, I was blessed to have so much archival stuff to work with. But that's a really good question, and It was on the Devoto's mind. I know that. They did take certain steps to hide some of their letters for an amount of time. I will say that one of the first people, when I wanted to start working on this project, one of the first people I reached out to was Mark Devoto, who is the last surviving son of Bernard and Avis Devoto.
Yeah. And he's still with us.
He is still with us, and he was incredibly cooperative with me. I'm so grateful to him. He sat for hours of interviews with me. And, his mom, one of the ironies of this world, among many of them, is that Avis Devoto is very well known in pop culture now, which she never ever expected and she never wanted. She was an incredibly, incredibly private person. I mean, she did give her letters to Harvard University, but she did it on the condition that they would stay sealed until after she was dead. So, between having Mark's blessing to work on this project and knowing that, Avis Devoto was incredibly, incredibly private, never wanted attention in her life. Never did she expect attention. She never expected to be an interesting historical figure. It's one of the only instances I know of Avis Devoto being wrong about something. But these materials were there, and they were sealed for an amount of time that made her comfortable by her choice. And then after that, having especially, talk to her son, I felt that I was okay to use the resource that was there, this incredible archival trove of letters.
And they are, in some cases graphic, in some cases, like the innermost thinking, almost like diary thoughts.
Very much, very much.
You've now mentioned this twice, so I don't want to leave people in too much suspense, but we can credit, I think, reading your book, Avis Devoto, with giving us Julia Child.
I think that's entirely accurate. And not only that, but one of the things that I don't think really has been recognized before. So Avis Devoto was Julia Child's best friend, and it's fun. I've been watching the HBO Max series Julia.
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, it's fun. It's good. It's highly fictionalized, but it's good. Okay. And Bebe Neuwirth plays Avis Devoto. Oh. And she's really cool. It's fun to watch her. I never found any video footage of Avis Devoto, so sort of the closest we can come to seeing Avis Devoto on film is watching Bebe Neuwirth play her in,
and she's great in everything.
She's great in everything. Yeah, she's great in this. Avis was also played in the movie Julie and Julia, which came out I think 2009. Deborah Rush played her opposite Meryl Streep playing Julia Child, but it's a wonderful story. To tie it all in, Bernard was getting blacklisted from these big magazines because Joe McCarthy was attacking the magazines, and thankfully he had Avis, his perfect partner in every way, emotionally and professionally, and this was their livelihood. His writing was their livelihood, so they had to figure out how to compensate for his getting blacklisted. So he started writing articles for a woman's magazine under a pseudonym. Yeah,
and he did that for other places as well.
Yeah, he did pseudonym work at other places.
Serials. And
other times he when he was younger he wrote under a pseudonym. He wrote sort of very well paid, but not very not very smart, shall we say, articles. He did that under a pseudonym to make a lot of money in order to subsidize the work he really wanted to do under his own name. But at this time, he was writing under a pseudonym because he was getting blacklisted in the McCarthy era. But he started brainstorming with Avis. They started working together more closely than they ever had before to think of new types of story ideas to write, how to write stories that would reach new audiences. And Avis told him, there's all these. This was the dawn of, kind of the stereotypical 1950s housewife, and she was saying this is a new market in America. There are women that are reading magazines. You need to write articles that will appeal to women readers. And Avis suggested that he write about kitchen knives.
Yeah,
and he did. He put it in Harper's Magazine, and that got Bernard Devoto a fan letter from an aspiring cookbook chef, a cookbook author living in Paris, Julia Child. And Avis, because she often answered Bernard's mail, wrote back. And, you can see the gears turning in Avis's head because she was fascinated with cooking and with cookbooks. And she gets this letter from this woman who's saying, I'm at work on a cookbook. And Avis tells Julia Child, basically, I know everybody in publishing through my husband. I am going to get you a book contract. And she does. And she ends up saving Julia Child's career a couple times. But yes, she's the person that brought Julia Child to mass attention. She's the reason that we know of Julia Child. Avis DeVoto is the reason that Julia Child is such a legend today.
I was thinking as I was reading through the book of the research of all of the letters that you had come your way. And a conversation that I had a couple years ago when I was in Missoula, Montana.
Hey, good place.
With your very good friends, Lido and Jessica Vasuzi.
I love Lido and Jessica Vasuti.
That was the gin messing up their consonants and
I would
vowels.
say that stone cold sober.
That's right. We were talking about you, and the idea of the Nate Schweber text message came up. Oh my
goodness!
Where most people will just be like, "Hey, running late on my way," or "Hey, how you doing?" and somebody would just respond, "Okay." By and large, your text messages are letters. You go on for several screens of thought. No. This is a really good thing. But I don't know where these text messages are going to be archived for future generations when they write the book about you writing this book and all the work that is still to come for you. But there's something to be said about the loss of letter writing.
I was thinking about that a lot when I was working on this project. I mean, I thought, what are nonfiction writers, historical nonfiction writers, going to do in the future? Like, when I was in the process of doing the research, I was very aware of how lucky I was to have these incredible archives of these incredible letters from these incredible writers. And I thought, wow, in 50 years, are people going to be looking back on, like, what, tweets? Texts?
Yeah. But even how?
Yeah.
I mean, with people in control of their data,
yeah.
Just deleting stuff and just, and think about all of the emails that are written every day as almost nothing.
Yeah. And they go into the trash. Yeah.
Yeah. But there was something obviously very personal about these because you were putting pen to paper and it had to be thoughtful. It wasn't backspace.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase that. It was, there's a level of trust in what you were writing that the person wasn't going to share it. But then, of course, there wasn't also social media of you won't believe what I just heard from. Yeah. But it is going to get harder for books like this to be done in the future.
Yeah, I think it might. I mean, I want to be optimistic and say, well, who knows what future narrative nonfiction writers are going to figure out how to do with the resources. Maybe we're going to find really cool books that get written based on text messages. I'm sure there are future biographers of the 45th president who are going to confront that exact challenge.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, maybe texts and Facebook posts, maybe there will be a cool creative way to make those into really gripping nonfiction. God bless the writers who are trying to figure that out.
We're going to do that.
Yeah.
When you think about the future of America's land, of public land, where are the fights today?
There were a lot of, not even indirect parallels. There were a lot of direct parallels. Again, I was working on that book really between like 2016 and 2021. And, in the book I write about a national monument in Utah that is on the brink of being destroyed. And between 2016 and 2021, 2 national monuments in Utah were ordered by executive order to be reduced by 50% and 90% respectively. I was writing about a movement that arose in the West by a very vocal minority to sell off America's public lands around 2015, 2016, there arose a very vocal minority in the West that were dedicated to selling off America's public lands. So, these, if history is any guide, the future is going to see these fights all over again. And, as with all the beautiful things in life, they can be wrecked. They have to be saved always because they can only be wrecked once. But I think, the story of Bernard and Avis Devoto and what they did and how they did it in their time. They got this amazing coalition together. They were very smart and very strategic in building this coalition. They paid really close attention. Those tools worked in their time, and hopefully, for the sake of national parks and all other public lands, hopefully those same tools, perhaps modified to whatever future situations arise, hopefully those tools will work again.
Do you have faith that they will?
Long pause. I can't say no because that would be,
You're also a journalist who just covers what's happening in real time. No, I know.
No, but it's always, one of the things Bernard DeVoto would say is, to some people, it's always 11:59 in America. Like we've always been on the brink of ruin. There's always been Americans at every single stage in American history who's like, that's it. Everything is done. Everything's about to go to hell right now. Everything used to be so much better. That's a constant in American history. And, there's been a lot of damage done, but there's also been a lot of great things that have been saved, including national parks and public lands. And, as more, and again, the Devotos built a broad coalition to protect public lands, and hopefully that coalition is getting bigger and bigger. Indigenous communities are having more of a say in what happens on public lands, which were their homelands. That's a very hopeful thing. More Americans are understanding about that public lands are our American birthright, our shared heritage. And again, the increased awareness of them, the more people that know, the more people that understand the stakes, the safer those lands are going to be. So I do think that more people are becoming aware of the value of public lands and what's at stake, and just the sort of psychic connection between public lands where everyone is free to move around and freedom of thought. The wilderness was the natural world that was encountered by the first Americans, from which they came up with these conceptions of American democracy. There's a real spiritual connection between public lands, freedom of movement, and freedom of thought.
One of the things that I was thinking about with advocacy is, so I've never been to Yellowstone. And I feel like it's one of those things.
We got to go sometime,
well,
man.
Yeah, and you know a thing or two about it from previous books and obviously life. But it's one of those things that I'm aware of, and I've seen documentaries about. But I feel like this is that East Coast elitism that show up, or coastal elitism, where the middle of the country is that flyover zone. And so you hear about these things, but getting to Yellowstone takes work. And getting to, some of the parks, actually, it's not, landing at McCarran or Harry Reid Airport and being literally being on the strip. It takes some effort to do.
I'm of the school of thought that says, thank goodness it requires work to get to.
I know, but I feel like that is one of those things that can be just the slightest hurdle for some people.
Well, you've been to Denali. I've never been to Denali.
Yeah, but I walked in, and I went 50 feet into the park and was
more
like,
than
hey,
I've
this is
done.
cool.
That's on my bucket list.
But again, this is not, I didn't camp there. I stayed at the Holiday Inn down the street because
you still visited.
Yeah,
you still got to have a Denali experience,
which was cool, and it was neat to see. I wonder. I mean, you can't make things mandatory, but I wonder if some of these fights would be just a little bit easier if we all, at some point early in our lives, when able, saw these things up close and understood the vastness and the important. People go to the Grand Canyon, and it's awe-inspiring once, like the second time you go,
every single time.
Now it's a big hole.
Maybe
like
for you.
Yeah.
I am an objective journalist, but
yes, you are.
Often. But I did think that one of the cool things that Barack Obama did was he made it so that every fourth grader in America and their families got free admission to national parks. I thought that was a really cool idea because I do think that exposure to it, and national parks, they are such treasures that you can experience them just through TV shows or through legend or through hearing about them, and they'll still have an important place in your a sacred spot in your mental realm. But I do think that and again, that's the DeVoto idea. That's the James Madison idea about America. The more people that have a stake, that understand the stakes, the safer the safer these things are going to be.
And we need protectors of it, and we need vocal people that bring this to the forefront. And I'm so grateful you wrote this book.
Thanks, man. Well, I'm thankful you read it and wanted to talk to me about it. Again, dear listeners out there, this book never would have been written if it wasn't for John Hall.
No. That's I will say that even if you weren't one of my dearest friends, I would be shouting this book from the rooftop. It's called This America of Ours. Bernard and Avis DeVoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. Nate Schweber, thanks for sitting in the backyard, and thanks for the potent cocktails. And
I am so happy to be on Steal This Beer. I am going to steal some beer
also
next.
Not that podcast.
That's what it says on the...
No.
I thought it said that on my podcast.
Jesus Christ.
Anyway, I've been drinking a DeVoto Dry Martini while we have been talking.
Your music has been the theme music of Drink Beer, Think Beer since its founding, and also the old podcast as well. And you're bringing up the Augie Carton Show. Thanks very much, pal. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to have you here in the backyard at my house.
Can I plug Drink Beer, Think Beer by John Hall? A very good book. So anyway, conversations start well with a DeVoto Dry Martini. They don't always end well with them. But you can tell that jovial feeling is engendered by drinking these things and talking.
All right, get at us, y'all. Jesus Christ.
I should play Lawyers, Guns, and Money.
You should. You want to play a couple of bars of it?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes, I do.
All right.
Takes us back to working on Indiana breweries. I was gambling in Havana. I took a little risk. Send lawyers, guns, and money. Dad, get me out of this. Ha!
Oh, I thought you were going to keep going.
Oh, I thought I had a time limit, man.
No, man.
Ah, well.
All right. That was great.
Send lawyers, guns, and money. Huh. Send lawyers, guns, and money. Ow! Send lawyers, guns, and money.
All right. I think that's pretty good. I think that we don't have to pay the royalties on that now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because it was in 2 sections.
Right. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, pal.
Thanks for having me on, John.
If you're listening to this and like what you hear, you can reach out to Nate directly via his website, nateschweber.com. He's available for talks, events, and even live music. Breweries, get on this and add him to your lineup. You won't be disappointed. And don't forget, This America of Ours, his new book, is available for pre-order now and releases on July 5th, 2022. Get your copy wherever books are sold. Also, a quick reminder that the Craft Brewery Cookbook is now on sale where books are sold. Get a copy today. And don't forget to go visit All About Beer, which is back online. It's allaboutbeer.com, where you can catch up with great content. We're able to bring you this show each week, thanks to the companies that want to support independent journalism in the beer space. Customers are rushing to your store. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. Shopify POS is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/drinkbeer. That's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/drinkbeer. Don't forget, Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday, and the BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. And go visit allaboutbeer.com. As for this show, Nate Schweber, hey, you know him. He does the music. Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Hall. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'm going to be back again to drink beer and to think beer.